Hi, this is Jeff Kober, and we welcome you to Disney Insights. Walt Disney loved New Orleans, and from day one he sought to incorporate the essence of the French Quarter into Disneyland Park. While New Orleans Square wasn't opened until 1966, there has always been, since day one, a New Orleans street. It stretched from the Golden Horseshoe down along the rivers of America. It was a contrast to nature's Wonderland with its mine train, packed mules, and stagecoaches. It was one of the key dining points in the park, and Walt loved this stretch, where he often enjoyed a weekend morning breakfast watching the ships along the rivers of America prep and ready for the day's activities. But he wanted more, and in time he built New Orleans Square, and with it came two of perhaps Disney's greatest attractions, Pirates of the Caribbean and the Haunted Mansion, benchmarking each end of the square. They sandwiched an unusual twist of streets with shops and restaurants, with his beloved train passing through it all. And all of it was tied together by the legendary Mark Twain Steamboat. It is quintessentially one of the most unique spaces in any Disney park, and with it comes some wonderful inspirational lessons in business and life. So, in celebration of Disneyland's 70th anniversary, we explore all of this and more in today's podcast, which celebrates the charm of both New Orleans Street and Square. This podcast is produced by myself and Performance Journeys, which offers training and development and consultants support to organizations big and small and to entrepreneurs new and established. You have an upcoming conference? Hey, if you're in charge, reach out to me. Provide keynote speakers, as well as a variety of resources and long time in the trench experience, whether it's workshops, online learning, coaching, and so much more, to organizations that want to build teams, raise organizational excellence, improve leadership, and create customer loyalty, all from best in business ideas from the Disney parks and more. Please also, support us by not only subscribing to this podcast, but offering up a rating, review, or referral to others. Be sure to check out DisneyInsights.com, where we offer keynotes, photos, points, videos, links, and so much more. And also note that our YouTube carries our podcast, which is also known as Disney Insights. So please subscribe to our YouTube page, as it will become a part of our social media strategy, even more so in the days forward. We welcome any positive thoughts and comments on our YouTube channel as well, and we'll post and read those comments as they come along on the air. Well, without further ado, let's talk about Walt's love of New Orleans, to understand his affection toward the Crescent City is to understand Walt's love of the Mark Twain. In the words of Ward Kimball, quote, "To Walt Disney, the Mark Twain and the Disneyland trains were like the seventh and eighth wonders of the world," end of quote. So, Walt, when he built Disneyland, needed a steamboat. It would be the queen of the river, and it would be authentic. With that in place, it would need a world to surround it. And that world was New Orleans. Walt's interest in New Orleans goes back to earlier times, years before Disneyland became a reality. Originally, in trying to have something of a second honeymoon, Walt Disney and Lillian flew to St. Louis in hopes of taking a steamboat down the mighty Mississippi to New Orleans. Well, it turns out that the last ship to do that in that era had come to an end, and the couple ended up ultimately in Key West and then Cuba. But eventually, the couple made their way to New Orleans in November of 1940, and then many times afterwards for both business and pleasure. He enjoyed dining and eventually got to know Mayor Shiro, who made Walt an honorary citizen of New Orleans in June of 1959. The two would play around with the idea of switching roles between being mayor of New Orleans and the mayor of Disneyland. Two important trips were of note. Well, on one such trip to New Orleans, Walt came across a small mechanical bird housed in a cage. A switch would produce lifelike movements and little chirps. Walt, fascinated with it, purchased it and took it back to Roger Broggie, inviting him to take it apart and discover how it worked. According to Wendy Lefkin's book on Imagineering, quote, "It was like taking apart a piece of jewelry. When I finally got it all apart and laid everything out, I found a little bellows made of canvas and some little cams and other parts," end of quote. Walt was envisioning a way that his traveling display of scale models might have characters that could come to life. We later came to know this as the Enchanted Tiki Room and ultimately what became audio animatronics. A second rather interesting event with New Orleans took place much later when Walt made an initial site selection for the Florida project on November 22nd of 1963. His private plane, his Gulfstream, took him over some coastal sites, which confirmed Walt's disinterest in building there, and then it turned to Central Florida. Since secrecy was already vital to Disney's plans, he decided not to land his plane in Orlando and instead stopped to refuel in New Orleans on his way back to California. When he landed, he was told that John F. Kennedy had been assassinated in Dallas. Over time, Walt brought the spirit of New Orleans to Disneyland. First with New Orleans Street, which opened along with the park in 1955. This essentially held a number of restaurants for guests to enjoy. It was a perfect complement to the Mark Twain, which sailed down the river past the dining locations featured. In 1960, the very first New Orleans-themed celebration was held in the park, featuring major artists and popular New Orleans jazz entertainers at that time. A major step came when New Orleans Square was dedicated with Mayor Victor Shiro appearing with Walt on July 24th of 1966. Shiro again presented a medal making him honorary citizen of New Orleans, and he noted that New Orleans Square cost more than the Louisiana Purchase. Walt presented the mayor a key to Disneyland's New Orleans. This would be one of Walt's last major public appearances in the park. Months later, Walt would pass away, and then a few months later, Pirates of the Caribbean would open on March 18th of 1967. It quickly became one of the most iconic and successful attractions ever created at Disneyland. Curiously, the exterior for the Haunted Mansion on the opposite side of New Orleans was already completed in 1963, but the attraction did not open until August 9th, 1969. And with its opening, New Orleans Square became a juggernaut of two of the most popular attractions ever created for Disneyland. Now, winding through all of this is the Mark Twain. The Mark Twain was dedicated on the opening day of Disneyland by Irene Dunne, who played the lead female role in the 1936 version done by Universal, not the later MGM version done in 1951. She christened the ship with a bottle filled with waters from rivers across America, thus christening the river itself, appropriately named the Rivers of America. Just days prior, it hosted especially invited guests when Walt and Lillian Disney celebrated their anniversary riding the Mark Twain for the first time, and then celebrating in the Golden Horseshoe for its first performance. On July 17th, 1955, the Mark Twain opened to the general public. This steamship was inspired by many, like that sailed before her down the Mississippi. They were beautiful but fragile ships. With all of its intricate lattice, one had to be careful not to ground her on the river. Hence the depth calls of Mark I and Mark Twain. One also had to be careful of boilers overheating, blowing up, and resulting in a fatal calamity, often the fate of ships that sailed down these rivers. By the time this replica of a steamboat opened with Disneyland on July 17th, 1955, those sort of concerns had long been resolved. But there were still other problems to be encountered. Cast member Terry O'Brien was one of the first cast members hired at that time. Observing all of the excitement of that opening day with its parades and celebrities like Art Linkletter and Ronald Reagan, it was pretty easy to be distracted. O'Brien's role was to admit guests into the holding area where they would await the next ship. Since the ship was brand new, they really had no idea how many to admit at one time onto the ship. The designers estimated the number would be kept around 200, 300. With no turnstile, Terry was given a clicker, and all day long he would click as people entered into the holding area. After a while, the job became, mundane, so O'Brien started chatting with guests. The ship came into the landing and another group took off. Shortly afterwards, the ship signaled trouble. With so many guests on board, the boat had derailed off track and sunk into the mud. It took a while for management to get it fixed and back on rail. As it came back to the landing, all the people rushed to the side to get off of it, and the boat tipped into the water again. The supervisor approached Terry and asked how many people he'd put on the boat. Quickly, Terry responded, about 250, to which the supervisor suggested that, maybe we should keep it around 200. As the supervisor left, Terry took a look at the clicker and realized that he had actually put 508 passengers aboard the ship. Embarrassed, he told no one. Then he made sure it never happened again. Well, the reality is that everyone makes mistakes, and we must create a learning culture so people learn from those mistakes. When we don't allow people to make mistakes and learn from them, they tend to go underground. Much preferred is an organization that permits people to identify lessons from their mistakes and to use them as opportunities for improving the organization. That's what happened on day one of the Mark Twain, and it was a powerful lesson for Terry O'Brien as one of its first cast members. Now, assuming the Mark Twain did go down the rivers of America the right way, you then passed what was known as New Orleans Street. This is long before New Orleans Square. On August 9th, 1955, just a few weeks after the park originally opened, singer and actress Dorothy Lamour, a hometown girl of New Orleans, arrived on a horse-drawn surrey with her husband, an actor, also playing the Frito Kid, Plains Indians from the Indian Village, and Aunt Jemima. We'll explain a little bit more later. They were all there in what was referred to as Frontierland Park to open and dedicate not New Orleans Square, but New Orleans Street. In the happiest place on earth, Dorothy remarked, quote, "It looks exactly like the wonderful city in which I was born," end of quote. At which time she took a bottle filled with water from the Mississippi and banged it over Jean Lafitte's anchor, which at that time was displayed in a location closer to Frontierland, as there was no New Orleans Square, nor would there be for another 10 years. One of the earliest images of this area of Disneyland features a Herb Ryman image showing New Orleans Street. Let's walk through this, and by looking at these set of buildings, maybe get a better understanding for its history. Of course, first there is the Golden Horseshoe. This is the toe that is firmly set in Frontierland. Adjacent is what is known as Oak's Tavern. I believe in the very opening days of the park, it was known as the Malt Shop. Today, it's known as the Stage Door Cafe. I say malt shop because the original park map of that time showed a malt shop in Frontierland, and there was no Carnation Gardens, so I don't think it was aligned with that, which would have been more toward Main Street. There was, at one point, food and beverage served on the Mark Twain, but I don't think they had started that. I think it was actually a malt shop. Today, it's known as the Stage Door Cafe. This is probably the most appropriate title, as it really feeds off the kitchen at the Golden Horseshoe. Next door was what was originally called in the park opening year map as Frito House. Most know it as Casa de Fritos, but they also know it as such because of its location on the other side of Frontierland, where Zocalo restaurant is today. They moved from this original location because there simply wasn't enough room for the demand Southern California residents had grown to for having Mexican food. When Frito-Lay left, the operation was taken by Don DeFore's Silver Banjo Barbecue. It was the only restaurant named after another person besides Walt Disney himself. That's because Don, a good friend of Walt's, was given the opportunity to open up his own operation. Don DeFore was a TV favorite for his roles in The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet, as well as Hazel. The operation ran from June of 1957 to March of 1962. The silver banjo was a reference to his association with his father, who played the banjo. While Don struggled to find enough barbecue sauce to run the operation, he ended up drawing from Love's Barbecue, which was a chain of barbecue restaurants in California. When matters came down to the bone, the city of Anaheim determined that the kitchen facilities were inadequate. And with his success in television, he was just simply too busy to keep it going. That is why there is a space there with no real operation out of it. There's a gap, in other words, between where we all see the Stage Door Cafe and then what ultimately becomes the River Belle Terrace. The Aunt Jemima's Pancake House took over that back of house space in a remodel to add to the success of their operation. Aunt Jemima's Pancake House is a story unto itself I'll get to in a few minutes. But it is the bookend for this set of restaurants, all under the same roof structure there in Frontierland. From here, we come to a crossroads where Frontierland meets Adventureland, which today meets New Orleans. Indeed, it is said that the fencing of the New Orleans street goes from wood to metal rail in front of what was Aunt Jemima's, and is actually where New Orleans Square technically begins. Still, Aunt Jemima's, now known as the River Belle Terrace, is really the center of where everything comes together. From there, you crossed a small bridge into the space most would come to know as New Orleans Square today. At that time, there was no access to Adventureland. We covered that in a previous podcast, as we did with, by the way, Frito-Lay in the Frontierland podcast. But the rivers of the Jungle Cruise did run into the rivers of America, and thereby you need a little footbridge to get across it. There is only one other restaurant that makes up this riverfront area, and that is the Chicken Plantation, that for many years stood on the waterfront separate of any other location, in a central place most guests would want to stand if they were watching Fantasmic today. Dick Nunis, when he was asked once about his favorite part of Disneyland, which is no longer there, shared, quote, "I miss the old Chicken Plantation, where I spent many Sundays sitting with Walt talking about the future of Disneyland. I remember one day the Mark Twain was coming around the bend, a keelboat was coming in, a keelboat was leaving, 2 rafts were crossing the river, 2 Indian war canoes were racing each other, and Walt said, 'Look at that. That's a great show. What we need is another boat.' And that's when we decided to build the sailing ship Columbia." By the way, end of quote. By the way, we'll talk about the Columbia when we get to Bayou Country in our next podcast dealing with Disneyland's 70th anniversary. But in the meantime, Imagineer legend Marvin Davis noted, quote, "I think he," being Walt, "took more interest in the river than anything else." End of quote. That might have been, speaking of rivers and ships, the anchor referred to earlier, the Lafitte's anchor, was purchased by Walt and Lillian on a trip to New Orleans, where legend has it was used by Jean Lafitte some 200 years before. But as the sign says, don't believe everything you read. Well, let's talk a little bit about this thing called Aunt Jemima's Pancake House. It's known as the River Belle Terrace today, but from the earliest times it was known as Aunt Jemima's Kitchen, and previous to that, Aunt Jemima's Pancake House. As many partnerships or lessees operated food and beverage as well as retail in the parks, so was this restaurant, which was ran by Quaker Oats. The menu at that time was focused on pancakes, especially in the early days. You could order Davy Crockett's Delight, Slewfoot Sue's Favorite, or go big with 4 pancakes when you tried the Mark Twain Special. Aunt Jemima was a fictional character made up by Quaker Oats years earlier. It had a whole backstory all of its own that if you didn't know better, you thought Aunt Jemima was the last one holding the fort down for the Confederacy during the Civil War. Actress Arlene Lewis played Aunt Jemima when the park opened, and she was very popular. Guests sought her out for a photo just like you would a Disney character. With that came pancake races down Main Street on National Pancake Day. Be the first to flip your pancake off the griddle all the way down the street, and you won a $100 prize. Big money for back then. By the way, there were many Aunt Jemima restaurants across the country, but none looked as fancy or beautiful as nice as the one in Disneyland, and none were more popular. Walt's daughter Diane noted, this was one of Walt's favorite dining spots. Quote, when Mother and Dad would spend their weekends there, Dad had this little routine. He'd get dressed and walk the park before anyone else was there. They were still sweeping the streets and watering it down, and then he had breakfast at the Pancake House. It was his neighborhood. There was another famous resident of this kitchen, the Mickey Mouse Pancake. The vice president in charge of batter, that's actually a job title, believe it or not, Rick Hubbard, created a 3-in-1 combination, which added a pineapple mouth and a cherry nose. It wasn't originally on the menu, but could be requested on days when the kitchen was not too busy. Ultimately, it lasted longer than Aunt Jemima herself, and it can still be found today in the Red Rose Tavern. As I had mentioned in a previous podcast, that was kind of a personal favorite of mine to go get a Mickey Mouse pancake. Back then, the Pancake House, most of it was more of a buffeteria style where you went through a serving line, picked up what you wanted, and then went on to find a table. Now, the last restaurant along New Orleans Street before we get to New Orleans Square is the Chicken Plantation. When staff at Disney were skeptical about building a park down in Anaheim in those early days, and mind you, remember, this is a place where a freeway had not yet connected. And it was safe to say that Walt could see that if your standard were good enough, people would still make the drive. And the benchmark for his vision on that was nearby in Buena Park, where Walter and Cordelia Knott had started a chicken restaurant nearly 2 decades prior. So popular was this intimate dining locale that Walter started building attractions to include a ghost town and other things to keep waiting guests occupied as they awaited their table and turn to dine. Walt and Walter had a number of conversations about what it was like to handle crowds and to run such an attraction. When Disneyland opened, the Knotts were given passes to visit Disneyland anytime they would like, and they were invited to attend the opening day at Disneyland, which they did. What they found when they visited was a chicken restaurant at the end of what was Frontierland, along what is now the riverfront of New Orleans Square. Operated by Swift, its original design referred to it as the Chicken Shack, but by the time the 2-story structure was built, it was clearly going to be renamed the Chicken Plantation. The restaurant held seats for some 350 people, and it was perhaps the best restaurant on property in the early years. It was operated by Swift, who also ran or was the lessee of the Market House and the Red Wagon Inn, known as the Plaza Inn today. The chicken plantation would continue in operation until 1962, when Swift's lessee operation ended and work began on the building of New Orleans Square as we know it now. The Red Inn became a more ornate Plaza Inn with lush furnishings while enjoying fried chicken, which is still served today. The Knotts were there, as I mentioned earlier, on opening day, and were probably concerned of the park's attendance on their own operation. But when they returned that day back to their restaurant, they were surprised to find that the parking lot was filled to capacity at their location. Indeed, Disneyland's success inspired Walter Knott to add more attractions himself, a reminder that a rising tide raises all ships. Both worked to make Southern California, and particularly Orange County, a major tourist destination. By the way, the one thing both shared was a great meal. Quote, "Build it and they will come," didn't always fare well as a motto for dining. In 1960, the former president of Disneyland, C.V. Wood, who was ousted by Roy O. Disney himself, went on to create a chicken plantation restaurant in Freedom Land on the northern part of Manhattan. Sponsored by J.D. Jewell Incorporated, it ultimately met its demise along with the whole of the attraction, which failed to follow the kind of attention to detail Walt and Walter had built into their theme parks. So as you can see here, there was a whole New Orleans street. There was a whole place where you got the feel of New Orleans, and you got it by simply visiting many of these dining locations that were quite popular during that time. Now, let's talk about New Orleans Square itself. Why do people love New Orleans Square? I mean, that whole set of shops and restaurants sandwiched between Pirates of the Caribbean and the front or New Orleans Railroad Station. I see that there are 4 reasons for why this little space works so well. The first is intimacy. The street design is intimate, with narrow paths leading among the shops and restaurants. The effect is similar to how backlots were and are created in studios, where you really never see the end of the street. That layout, if you were to look at it from the air, is in the shape of a W, and you kind of just continue to weave throughout the space. The second would be depth. Leaving the street, you enter any number of shops or restaurants. What makes this unique is that beyond those indoor spaces, you often step into back alleys and little corners. And then from there, you can look up and see an entire second floor of activity occurring up above. It really just gives you a feeling like it just goes on and on. The third reason is story. No facade is the same. Every porch is different. Canopies are different styles and colors. Every store window tells a different story. Every store tells serves a different purpose. One store offered one-of-a-kind wares. Another showcase specialty kitchenware. There is still Mademoiselle Antoinette's Parfumerie and Crystal d'Orleans. And now there is Eudora's Chic Boutique featuring Tiana's Gourmet Secrets. Every store, every restaurant has its own story, its own setting, its own experience. And the fourth reason I would say is because of detail. Inside or out, the detail is as authentic to the best of the French Quarter as possible. Imagineers consulted books and National Geographic magazines and their own travels to bring that same New Orleans sensibility to Disneyland. There are relics and inspired replications, such as mechanical toys, ornate bases, lacy wrought iron lampposts, and railings selected and brought back from New Orleans by Walt and Lillian Disney themselves. Add decorations for holidays like Mardi Gras, and you are truly drenched in the magic of it all. By the way, only one other park created the experience of New Orleans Square, and that is Tokyo Disneyland. Only instead of a sort of W shape, it has more of a U shape. Still, it also has the essence of New Orleans as you enter from the top of World Bazaar, or the hub area of the park. World Bazaar is, by the way, Tokyo Disney's main street. And then you follow from the Crystal Palace, which is taken from Walt Disney World, all along a set of locales that are actually the back of World Bazaar, their main street, but all done in this New Orleans theme. It all creates a French Quarter type feel. And so even though it is very differently designed, it works very well as a French Quarter type experience. Now let's talk about some of the great attractions in New Orleans Square. And we'll begin with Pirates of the Caribbean. Now, I have more material on Pirates of the Caribbean than has been written in any book. And there is a lot to cover, whether we're talking even just about Disneyland, let alone all the other places it shows up across the world. So I'm just going to take one little piece to give you a sense of the detail of Pirates of the Caribbean. You know, you enter the building and immediately you see this set of boats coming to a dock, and you line up in your queue, and at that dock, guests are able to embark and disembark on this attraction. Now, when Pirates is operating at its theoretical hourly ride capacity, these bateau boats are able to launch every 20 seconds, creating a capacity of 3,600 guests per hour. Lafitte's Landing is what it's called, and it relates to Jean Lafitte. Remember the one we're talking about with the anchor? Jean Lafitte was a real person, a 19th century privateer who fought in the Battle of New Orleans, the final battle in the War of 1812. Lafitte and his family conducted a smuggling and piracy operation out of New Orleans, working the Gulf of Mexico. Note that once you get on the boat, you head into the bayou, where you see across from yourself is the Blue Bayou restaurant, which is truly one of the most, again, going back into that depth thing we talked about, which makes New Orleans, who imagines that you walk into this ornate living room entrance only to step into an entire back patio, which is just overlooking the Pirates of the Caribbean attraction. By the way, if you turn around and instead of looking at the Pirates of the Caribbean attraction with the bateau passing by, turn around and look at the house that you theoretically entered in, that house is actually based on the design of the Chicken Plantation restaurant, which previously had stood up along the river. It holds the same kind of design. And the staircase on the side actually leads to Club 33, or actually the kitchen facilities, if I'm correct, of Club 33 in that area. But again, heritage and theming all kind of come together in one circle. The Chicken Plantation is not entirely lost. It's now captured in the Blue Bayou. That's just a taste of Pirates of the Caribbean. Now, consider another attraction, which we know as the New Orleans train station. There's a couple of insights that a lot of people don't know about this particular location. Originally, this was the Frontierland station, as it was at one point the furthermost part of Frontierland. In fact, going back to the Chicken Plantation restaurant, which was the closest building to the Frontierland station, the front of this Chicken Plantation restaurant looked like a southern mansion, again, same as the facade you see in the Blue Bayou. But the back of the house actually had an adobe look because you were arriving in Frontierland Station, so it gave you the sense that you were in a frontier section. And so the Chicken Plantation restaurant had two very different sides, front and back, one of which faced the Frontierland Station. Now, this depot that is here is based on the one constructed for the 1949 Disney film, So Dear to My Heart. That film was a pet project of Walt's, as it reminded him of his own childhood in Marceline, Missouri. Train scenes weave their way all throughout this film. When the movie was completed, Walt offered the train station depot itself to Ward Kimball, who, as a fellow lover of trains, himself had his own railway and an even larger gauge train in his backyard, similar to what Walt Disney would have. When Disneyland was built, Walt asked for the train station back so he could put it at Disneyland. Ward protested, as he had to make a considerable investment on it to make it stable, weatherproof, and more permanent. So Walt relinquished his request and instead used the original design from the film to create another replica of the station in Frontierland. The name changed to New Orleans Square Station in September of 1996, 2 months after New Orleans Square opened to guests. And when New Orleans Square was being built, the track for that part of the park was actually expanded further out west along the western side. And with that, the train station, which originally you entered in before you went into before you went on the train station was actually moved to the other side of the tracks, with simply a covered platform on the inside of the tracks for guests waiting to board. The water tower at this station is actually functional, whereas the one in Fantasyland is strictly ornamental. The station was used, and by the way, the station itself was actually used in the American Adventure at Epcot. In that presentation, there is a scene called Two Brothers, which represents the tension between the Union and Confederacy as represented by these two brothers who fought for different sides in the war. At the end of that sequence, the Confederate soldier is returned to the family after being killed in action, and you see images of the family awaiting the return of their son's remains at the train station. That train station is actually the one you see at Disneyland. When guests wait at the train station, they'll hear the sound of Morse code coming from within the station itself. Now, if you're good at decoding the message, you'll realize that this is actually the dedication read by Walt from the plaque at the flagpole when Disneyland opened on July 17th of 1955. So there's just a whole lot of little details attached to the New Orleans train station. Now, finally, we get to the Haunted Mansion. And again, this is one which I have covered in many different podcasts and is a bigger story in and of itself. But I do want to talk about, I think, one important lesson from the Haunted Mansion, which is really a great Disney-inspired insight for anyone trying to improve their organization. Every major attraction at Disneyland goes through years of development before it opens to the public. From idea to opening day, there is a long process in creating a great guest experience. Perhaps no attraction has had a longer development period than the Haunted Mansion, which opened to guests in August of 1969. Even before Disneyland opened in 1955, there were ideas of an old weathered home at the end of one of the side streets on Main Street at Disneyland. Over the years, several artists took turns at creating some kind of spook alley style experience. In time, there formed two frames of thought on the mansion. One group of Imagineers, led by Claude Coates, provided a sort of sinister, darker experience. The other group, largely led by Mark Davis, took from his success with Pirates of the Caribbean and a redo on Jungle Cruise and the Mine Train through Nature's Wonderland to create a montage of kind of funny experiences. Both groups went back and forth. Then matters only became more complicated when Walt Disney passed away in 1966. In the past, Walt would typically break such ties. Now, these Imagineers, they had to work it out themselves. Tony Baxter in Jason Sorrell's Haunted Mansion book explains that the compromise ended up creating a sort of 3-act play. One that enacted the creepiness of Claude Coates in the first portion of the attraction, the comedy of Davis's graveyard scenes in the third part, and kind of a marriage of the two during the ballroom and attic scenes. When it finally opened, guest reviews when the Haunted Mansion opened were very mixed. Many baby boomers were in their teenage years and they were looking for something much scarier. In fact, I remember waiting that summer. I was too scared as an 8-year-old to go on this attraction. But my brothers went on it and they waited about 3 hours. In fact, it may have been on August 16th because the week after it opened, Disneyland set its biggest attendance level of 82,516 people on that Saturday, August 16th. And that record stood for many years at Disneyland. In many ways, the attraction is timeless because of its mix of spooky and funny. But when my brothers went on initially, their comments was it was good, but I thought it would be a lot scarier. Still, again, Disney ended up as a team taking a long approach, and I think that approach also became very practical because of that mix of spooky and funny. Making the overture of the attraction dark and sinister also allows the walking portion to become kind of a litmus test to the younger ones to check out early before they board the doom buggies, which then commits them for the remainder of the experience. Exits allow them to leave prior to boarding the ride vehicle, just in case they can't take it any longer. It's a smart move, and it helps guests make choices as to whether they really want to visit all 999 happy haunts. In the end, the creative compromises that were made on the attraction not only serve to make it a better guest experience, it has made the attraction both timeless and very popular. Sometimes you have to use a little creative compromise. It can be interesting to see where other great ideas can be married to yours. Well, that does it for this big overview of New Orleans Square. We could go into so many other details about this attraction. But as you can see from our discussion here, there's a lot to understand and know about New Orleans Square. And there's more to that I'll be adding. Some of these stories will actually be on YouTube in the next couple of days. Also, another story dealing with chairs. Look for that one on our YouTube channel. So make sure you subscribe so you can catch that. And hopefully this podcast has made you realize that you might want some help and support in planning your next trip to Disney, particularly Disneyland. If you're one of those folks who've gone to Walt Disney World again and again and again, you might just need a little bit of help figuring out the Disneyland one. David and Leah with Zenola Travel know Disney in ways few do, and they can make your next trip on land or sea an exciting one, or at least less stressful. Be sure to contact them as you explore your next vacation, whether it's a Disney theme park trip, a cruise, or an adventure by Disney. There's no charge to utilize their services, but let me just tell you, it's going to save you an enormous time getting all the details right. And with their insight, you can be assured you're going to experience the best trip possible. Contact them today. If you like the stories, some of the stories that I've shared today, particularly the one I shared about the Mark Twain on opening day or the Haunted Mansion, the creative compromise used, you might check out my Disney Leadership in You, which is filled with stories over the decades about Disney and how they have sought to lead an organization that has lasted more than a century. In fact, there's also my book on A Century of Powerful Disney Insights, which talks about Walt and Roy during these years. And so you may want to check out that book as well as my wonderful world of customer service at Disney. All of those are available at Amazon, and you can actually get the links on our show notes and at DisneyInsights.com. Finally, this podcast and post is provided by myself and Performance Journeys, which celebrates more than 20 years as a training and development group bringing best in business ideas through books, keynotes, workshops, seminars, and online tools to help you take your organization to the next level. So if you're looking for an inspirational keynote speaker, let me tell you, I've got some great stories, inspirational stories, really fun stories. But in addition to that, I offer proven insight and solutions that have actually worked when they applied these ideas in other organizations. So we can provide a really great experience for you. If you're looking to improve your organization, maybe need some consulting, know that I've worked for decades across the public, private, and nonprofit arena. I know how to work with organizations like yours. And so if you need support from Classroom Online or other resources, whether you're trying to improve customer service delivery, leadership development, or employee engagement, team building, whatever it might be, contact me and let me help you. And thank you for joining us for this podcast. Know that, as in the title of Performance Journeys, it's as much about the journey as it is about performance. Find the second star to the right and keep going straight on till you reach it. Follow the compass of your heart and know that with a smile and a song and a little faith, effort, and pixie dust, your dreams can come true. After all, if we can dream it, we can do it. Until next time, bright suns, we'll see ya real soon.